For years, she remained the quiet royal, the one who smiled, stepped back, and never stirred controversy. But silence has a breaking point. Behind palace walls, whispers grew louder, alliances fractured, and secrets began to leak through the cracks. Now, Princess Eugenie has done the unthinkable. She's speaking out. And what she reveals isn't just shocking, it could rewrite everything we thought we knew about the royal family. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. In a monarchy built on tradition and tightly controlled narratives, an unexpected voice is often the most dangerous. Eugenia was never meant to be that voice. For years, she occupied the margins, present but peripheral, loyal but largely overlooked. The cameras captured her composure, her steady smile, her refusal to feed the tabloids. Yet beneath that calm exterior, something far more volatile was unfolding. Because in a family where every gesture is choreographed and every word is weighed, silence is not just restraint, it is strategy. And when someone who has mastered silence decides to abandon it, the consequences ripple far beyond personal grievance. Those closest to the palace gates began to sense it long before the public did. Subtle shifts, invitations that no longer came, seating arrangements that spoke louder than official statements. There were rumors of private disagreements, of sharp words exchanged in corridors heavy with history, a long simmering feud, never acknowledged, carefully buried beneath ceremonial smiles. The royal inner circle, once presented as immovable and unified, had begun to fracture into quiet factions, some clinging to rigid tradition, others pushing for adaptation in a world that no longer bows so easily. Eugenie stood at the crossroads of those divides, watching, absorbing, waiting. What makes her decision so powerful is not volume, but timing. For years, her restraint was interpreted as compliance. But silence can be a form of survival. It can also be a burden. The emotional strain of navigating loyalty to family while confronting private disillusionment leaves marks that no jeweled tiara can conceal. There were pressures from outside, relentless scrutiny, public speculation, the weight of expectation, and there were pressures from within, conflicting allegiances, whispered warnings, the unspoken rule that some truths must never leave the palace walls. To break that rule is not merely personal rebellion, it is a calculated risk, because her statement, layered and deliberate, is not simply about her own experience. It touches something deeper. It hints at structural tension. It suggests that the monarchy the public sees may not be the monarchy that exists behind closed doors. When she speaks of accountability, of evolution, of the need for transparency, the words land with unsettling force. They imply that the struggle is not isolated, but systemic, that there are multiple camps within the royal fold, those who believe preservation means silence, and those who believe survival demands exposure. And so the question is no longer whether there is division. The question is how deep it runs. If Eugenie, once the embodiment of discretion, feels compelled to step forward, what does she know that we do not? What alliances have shifted in the shadows? What private confrontations have reshaped the balance of power? Her voice, steady yet charged with quiet defiance, signals that something fundamental has changed, not in spectacle, but in substance. And once a royal cracks the facade, even slightly, the illusion of perfect unity begins to tremble. But to understand why Eugenia's voice matters now, we must go back to where the fractures first began, long before the world ever noticed. The royal family has always projected unity, a carefully curated image of tradition, strength, and loyalty. But behind the ceremonial smiles, something far more fragile was forming. Relationships strained, loyalties tested, and unseen rivalries began to surface. What appeared as minor disagreements were, in truth, the early tremors of a much deeper divide, one that would eventually pull even the most neutral voices into its storm. At first, the tension was easy to dismiss, a postponed appearance, a carefully worded statement that felt just a little too polished. But inside the monarchy's inner framework, subtle battles were already underway. Influence is currency in a royal institution, and not all titles carry equal weight. Senior figures guarded their authority fiercely, while younger members, raised in a rapidly changing world, quietly questioned the rigidity of tradition. Status was no longer just about birthright, it was about relevance, public approval, and the power to shape the narrative. And that shift unsettled those who had long relied on hierarchy as their shield. Generational divides sharpened the fault lines. The older guard believed survival depended on restraint and controlled exposure, endure the headlines, reveal nothing, adapt slowly, if at all. But a new wave of royals understood something different, that silence could look like indifference, and distance could breed distrust. They were fluent in public sentiment, aware that loyalty from the people was no longer automatic. These opposing philosophies did not erupt into shouting matches. They simmered beneath the surface, expressed through strategic alliances, private counsel, and calculated distancing. It was a chess game played without witnesses, yet its consequences were profound. Within this quiet struggle, rivalries began to crystallize. Not open hostility, but subtle competition, whose initiatives received prominence, whose charitable projects were elevated, whose voice carried weight in critical discussions. Public perception became both weapon and shield. A favorable headline could strengthen a faction, a damaging rumor could weaken another. And while the public saw coordinated appearances and shared platforms, behind closed doors, there were difficult conversations about succession, legacy, and control. Lines were drawn not in ink, but in trust. Princess Eugenie stood at the edge of these shifting alliances, often underestimated, rarely interrogated. She was present in rooms where decisions were debated and loyalties tested. She observed who deferred and who resisted. She saw how private disagreements were smoothed over before stepping into the public eye. More importantly, she recognized the emotional cost, the strain of smiling beside someone you no longer fully trusted, the exhaustion of maintaining solidarity while sensing fragmentation beneath your feet. She carried those observations quietly, saying little, revealing less. Then came what insiders would later describe only as the turning point. It was not a scandal splashed across headlines. It was quieter, a decision made without consensus, a boundary crossed, a moment when one faction asserted dominance in a way that left others feeling sidelined. For some, it was confirmation that adaptation was necessary. For others, it was proof that control must be tightened. Trust, once fractured, does not easily mend. After that moment, conversations grew more guarded, invitations more selective, loyalties more explicit. Public events continued with flawless precision. Speeches were delivered, charities were championed, the image of unity remained intact. But those who looked closely sensed a change in energy, a slight stiffness, an undercurrent of caution. What the world interpreted as routine evolution was, in truth, the slow hardening of internal camps. And in the midst of it all, Eugenie watched the balance shift, understanding that neutrality was becoming increasingly impossible. And while the world focused on the more visible players, few realized that Eugenie was watching, listening, absorbing everything. She wasn't the headline, she wasn't the rebel, she wasn't the heir, and that's exactly why no one saw her coming. While attention fixated elsewhere, Princess Eugenie stood quietly in the background, close enough to witness everything, distant enough to remain untouched, or so it seemed, but being overlooked gave her something dangerous: perspective. And now, that perspective is becoming impossible to ignore. In a system built on hierarchy and visibility, invisibility can be a strange kind of power. Eugenie moved through royal life without the suffocating glare reserved for future kings and controversial figures. She attended the same gatherings, heard the same guarded conversations, felt the same shifts in tone when certain names were mentioned. Yet she was rarely treated as a threat. That made people less courteous, us around her. It made their frustrations less filtered. And in those unguarded fragments, she began to piece together a truth far more complex than the polished statements released to the public. She had access to both sides of the growing divide. Invitations from one faction did not cancel invitations from the other. She listened as tradition was defended with near religious conviction. She listened again as reform was framed as survival. Each camp believed it was protecting the monarchy's future. Each believed the other was endangering it. Eugenie understood the sincerity on both sides, and that understanding became its own burden, because once you see the full picture, neutrality stops feeling simple. The emotional toll of remaining balanced in an unbalanced environment is rarely visible. There were moments when conversations turned sharp, when the air between relatives thickened with unspoken accusation. She felt the pull to intervene, to soften the edges, to insist that loyalty did not have to mean silence. More than once, she came close, a sentence half-formed, a truth hovering at the edge of release, but restraint won. Loyalty to family, to stability, to the unwritten rule that internal conflict must never spill outward. She chose silence not because she lacked conviction, but because she understood the cost of breaking rank. Yet, silence does not erase internal conflict. It amplifies it. Over time, she began to wrestle with a question that would not fade. At what point does loyalty become complicity, watching people she cared about drift further apart, witnessing decisions made behind closed doors that would ripple far beyond them? She formed her own conclusions. They were not impulsive. They were shaped slowly through observation and reflection. She recognized patterns: who held influence, who felt sidelined, who controlled the narrative when tensions rose. He noticed how quickly blame could be redirected, how carefully responsibility could be diffused. What she knows now is not the product of rumor or resentment. It is the result of years spent listening when others assumed she was merely present. That knowledge sits heavily, because perspective, once earned, demands reckoning. And as the divisions within the monarchy deepen, her role as silent witness grows more complicated. She understands the fragility of the institution. She understands the personal stakes. But she also understands that the story being told to the world is incomplete. The most dangerous truths are often held by those who were never meant to hold them. Eugenie did not seek to become a pivotal figure. Yet, by standing between opposing forces, by absorbing what others dismissed, she has become something unexpected, a bridge, or perhaps a fault line. And the longer she carries what she knows without speaking, the greater the pressure becomes. But even the quietest observer can only remain silent for so long, especially when the conflict begins to hit closer to home. Every silence has a breaking point, and for Princess Eugenie, that moment didn't come quietly, it erupted. A single incident, buried beneath layers of royal discretion, forced her to confront a reality she could no longer ignore. The lines between loyalty and truth blurred, and for the first time, she faced a choice that would define her place in the monarchy forever. And this time, silence wasn't an option. The incident itself was never publicly labeled a crisis. There were no dramatic announcements, no immediate headlines spelling out discord. Instead, it unfolded behind closed doors, in a meeting meant to settle rising tensions between opposing factions. What should have been a step toward unity became something else entirely, a decisive move that left one side feeling exposed and the other emboldened. Promises that had been implied were quietly withdrawn. Assurances were reframed. And in that recalibration of power, Eugenie witnessed what felt unmistakably like betrayal. It wasn't just political. It was personal. Someone she trusted found themselves isolated, subtly blamed for fractures that had been years in the making. Responsibility shifted with strategic precision. Conversations grew colder. The message was clear: protect the institution at all costs, even if it meant sacrificing individual voices. Eugenie felt the weight of that moment settle heavily. She understood the monarchy's instinct for survival, but she also recognized the human cost of maintaining a flawless facade. Almost immediately, the pressure began. Gentle reminders at first, the importance of unity, the danger of misinterpretation, the reminder that discretion was not merely tradition, it was duty. She was urged to remain steady, to resist emotional reactions, to trust that time would smooth over the tension. But time, she realized, was being used as a shield. Silence was being weaponized to rewrite what had happened. And with each passing day, the narrative drifting into the public sphere felt increasingly detached from the truth she had witnessed. Her internal struggle reached its peak in the quiet moments between public appearances and private reflection. Loyalty had always been her anchor. Family first, institution first. But what happens when loyalty demands the denial of your own conscience? She replayed conversations in her mind, reconsidered subtle warnings, questioned her own restraint. If she spoke, she risked alienation. If she stayed silent, she risked complicity. The choice was no longer theoretical. It was immediate and deeply personal. Emotional isolation began to creep in. Neutrality had once granted her access to all sides. Now it left her stranded between them. Some viewed her as unreliable for even questioning the official line. Others wondered why she had not already taken a stand. Trust thinned, invitations felt heavier. Even ordinary interactions carried an undercurrent of caution. For the first time, Eugenie understood what it meant to feel alone within a family that prided itself on unity. And still, the consequences loomed. Speaking out would not just shift her personal standing, it would signal that the carefully managed equilibrium inside the monarchy was more fragile than admitted. It could intensify factional divides. It could alter alliances. It could permanently redefine her role from observer to participant, from background presence to catalytic force. Yet staying silent would solidify a precedent she could no longer accept. The tension became unbearable, not because of public scrutiny, but because of private truth. She knew what she had seen, she knew what had been sacrificed, and she knew that history, left unchecked, would record a version of events that erased the complexity and the cost of that turning point. The breaking point was no longer about anger. It was about integrity, and when she finally did speak, what she revealed sent shockwaves far beyond palace walls. It wasn't just a statement, it was a rupture. When Princess Eugenie finally broke her silence, the words she chose weren't cautious. They were deliberate. Each sentence carried weight. Each revelation struck deeper than expected. And suddenly, the carefully maintained royal narrative began to unravel. What she exposed wasn't just a feud, it was a system of tensions, secrets, and power struggles, hidden in plain sight. Her tone was measured, but there was no mistaking the resolve beneath it. This was not an emotional outburst. It was controlled, precise. She spoke of accountability without naming names, of institutional resistance without dramatic accusator. And that restraint made it more powerful, because between the lines, a clearer picture emerged, one of internal divides that had been dismissed as gossip, of voices sidelined in the name of stability, of decisions made by a select few, while others bore the consequences. She did not shout. She did not dramatize. She simply confirmed what many had long suspected, but could never prove. The implications were immediate. By framing her experience as part of a broader structural problem, she shifted the focus from personal grievance to systemic imbalance. She suggested that the monarchy's greatest vulnerability was not external criticism, but internal rigidity. That progress had been stalled not by circumstance, but by calculated resistance. In doing so, she validated years of quiet rumors, whispers of factionalism, of strategic exclusion, of carefully managed optics designed to suppress dissent. What had once sounded speculative now felt disturbingly credible. Inside royal circles, the reaction was swift but controlled. One faction responded with icy composure, emphasizing unity and continuity, careful not to amplify her claims. Another, more privately aligned with reform, remained strategically silent, neither endorsing nor rejecting her words, but clearly unsettled by their accuracy. Shock rippled through corridors where loyalty had long been assumed. Disbelief surfaced among those who believed she would never cross that line. And yet, for some, there was recognition, a quiet acknowledgement that she had articulated what others had only dared to think. Strategic silence became the immediate counterattack. No dramatic rebuttals, no public confrontation. Instead, a tightening of messaging, appearances choreographed with even greater precision. The institution did what it has always done. In moments of strain, it absorbed the blow and projected calm. But beneath that calm, calculations were underway, alliances reassessed, trust reevaluated. Because once a member of the inner circle publicly questions the system, the illusion of unanimous loyalty fractures. And yet, perhaps the most unsettling aspect of her statement was not what she revealed, but what she withheld. There were pauses, carefully chosen omissions, references to moments she did not fully describe. It was clear she knew more than she shared. That restraint created a new kind of tension. If this was only a portion of the truth, what remained unspoken, what deeper conflicts, what private confrontations still lingered beyond public reach? The absence of detail became its own revelation. Unintended consequences quickly surfaced. Supporters praised her courage, amplifying her words in ways that escalated their impact. Critics accused her of destabilizing a fragile institution. Neutral observers began re-examining past events through a sharper lens. Old controversies resurfaced, reframed in light of her disclosures. What she may have intended as a call for reflection became a catalyst for broader scrutiny. The monarchy, once insulated by tradition, now faced renewed interrogation, not from outsiders alone, but from within. Her rupture did not destroy the institution, but it altered it. The balance of silence and speech had shifted. The cost of control had been exposed, and as the palace attempted to regain its footing, one truth became impossible to ignore. The narrative was no longer entirely in its hands, but her words didn't just expose the past, they ignited a reaction that no one inside the palace could control. The aftermath was immediate and far more intense than anyone anticipated. Behind closed doors, conversations turned confrontational, alliances shifted overnight, and the fragile balance within the royal family began to collapse. Eugenia's voice had done more than reveal, it had forced everyone else to respond. And in a family built on tradition and control, that kind of disruption was nothing short of explosive. Within hours, emergency discussions were convened, not to reflect, but to contain. Senior figures who had long mastered the art of composure found themselves grappling with something unfamiliar, exposure from within. Some reacted with sharp disbelief, dismissing her words as misguided interpretation. Others responded with quiet fury, interpreting her decision to speak as betrayal. There were those who chose calculated calm, insisting that unity must be publicly reinforced at any cost. But beneath every carefully measured sentence was urgency. The system had been challenged, and it did not take kindly to disruption. Confrontations followed, not theatrical, not dramatic in volume, but cutting in substance. Questions were asked in private rooms where loyalty had once been assumed. Why now? Why publicly? Who encouraged this? Eugenie faced not just disagreement, but interrogation of motive. Her integrity was subtly tested, her timing scrutinized, and yet, amid the attempts to reframe her actions, one truth lingered uncomfortably. She had not fabricated tension. She had illuminated it. Damage control became immediate strategy. Public appearances were accelerated, carefully staged to project solidarity. Statements emphasizing shared values and enduring bonds were drafted with meticulous care. The message was clear: stability remains intact, but inside, fractures deepened. Family members who once navigated disagreement with restrained diplomacy now viewed one another through a lens of suspicion. Old grievances resurfaced, sharpened by the knowledge that private conflict could no longer be guaranteed silence. Emotionally, the toll was undeniable. Anger flared among those who felt blindsided. Fear simmered beneath the surface for those who, worried about what might surface next. Betrayal was whispered in conversations that had once centered on strategy and tradition. Eugenie herself was not immune to isolation. The same relatives who once confided in her now measured their words. Neutrality had vanished. She was no longer an observer. She had become a catalyst. Shifting loyalties added another layer of instability. Some quietly admired her resolve, even if they could not publicly support it. Others aligned more tightly with established authority, reinforcing their commitment to hierarchy. Emerging power struggles intensified as factions recalculated influence in light of her revelations. Influence, once exercised subtly, now carried sharper edges. Decisions were no longer just about policy or public engagement, they were about control of narrative and preservation of dominance. The contrast between public image and private volatility grew stark. To the outside world, ceremonies proceeded with precision, statements projected confidence, and unity appeared unshaken. But internally, trust had eroded. Conversations were filtered, invitations reconsidered. Even routine discussions carried an undercurrent of caution. The monarchy, long practiced in presenting resilience, now found itself managing not just perception, but internal instability. And as tensions escalated, a new fear began to surface among senior figures: precedent. If one voice could disrupt the system so profoundly, what might follow? Would others find courage in her example? Would silence, once the institution's greatest shield, become its weakest defense? The conflict was no longer contained within one incident or one statement. It was evolving into something broader, a reckoning over how power is exercised and who gets to question it. The palace could attempt to suppress momentum. It could attempt to redirect attention, but control, once fractured, rarely returns unchanged. And as internal strain reached new heights, it became clear that this was no temporary turbulence. It was a structural shift. And as the palace struggled to contain the fallout, the outside world began to take notice, changing the stakes entirely. For years, the public saw only what the monarchy allowed them to see. But now, that carefully controlled image was cracking, and people were paying attention. Eugenie's words sparked a wave of questions, debates and speculation that couldn't be silenced. Suddenly, the royal family wasn't just a symbol of tradition, it was a story of conflict, complexity, and hidden truths waiting to be uncovered. The reaction was swift and relentless. Media outlets dissected every phrase she had spoken, parsing tone, timing, and implication. Commentators debated whether her statement was an act of courage or calculated disruption. Social platforms ignited with divided opinion, some praising her for challenging an outdated system, others accusing her of undermining an institution already under strain. What had once been confined to palace corridors was now global conversation. The monarchy, long shielded by ritual and reverence, found itself exposed to a level of scrutiny it could not easily deflect. Supporters saw validation in her words. They pointed to years of subtle signals, strained appearances, carefully worded announcements, abrupt shifts in roles that now seemed to confirm deeper instability. To them, Eugenie had not shattered unity, she had revealed honesty. Skeptics, however, questioned motive. Why speak now? Why in this way? Was this transparency or strategic positioning? The divide in public opinion mirrored the divide within the palace itself, amplifying tension rather than resolving it. As debates intensified, perception began to shift in measurable ways. The monarchy was no longer viewed solely as an unshakable symbol of continuity. It became a living institution grappling with internal contradiction. Commentators began exploring themes once considered off-limits: generational conflict, centralized authority, the emotional cost of duty. Her statement opened space for alternative narratives to surface stories from former insiders, re-examined past controversies, and renewed interest in how decisions were made behind closed doors. The mystique of flawless tradition gave way to a portrait of complexity. Curiosity about internal dynamics grew almost insatiable. Who truly holds influence? How are disputes resolved? What sacrifices are made in the name of unity? These were no longer whispered questions. They were headline inquiries. Journalists pressed for clarification. Analysts speculated about emerging factions. The institution's silence, once effective, now felt conspicuous. Every refusal to comment fueled further speculation, transforming absence of response into its own statement. Pressure began mounting on other royals to address the growing storm. Some offered reaffirmations of shared values, carefully avoiding direct reference to Eugenie's claims. Others maintained complete silence, hoping the cycle would exhaust itself. But the landscape had changed. In an era defined by transparency and immediacy, withholding engagement carried risk. The public appetite for clarity was expanding, and patience was thinning. The longer ambiguity lingered, the more narratives filled the vacuum. Momentum toward change felt increasingly irreversible. Even those resistant to reform recognized that something fundamental had shifted. The monarchy could attempt to recalibrate its image, to modernize selectively, to reinforce internal cohesion. But the awareness awakened by her words could not simply be undone. Once the idea of internal fracture entered mainstream discourse, it became part of the institution's evolving identity. Eugenia had not merely spoken, she had altered the framework through which the monarchy was understood. The contrast between ceremonial success and private strain became central to the story. Tradition now coexisted with tension in the public imagination, and as global attention intensified, the palace faced a reality it had long postponed. Adaptation was no longer optional, it was inevitable. But as the world demanded answers, one question remained: had Eugenie only revealed the beginning? This wasn't just a moment, it was a turning point. Princess Eugenie's decision to break her silence may have changed more than just one narrative. It may have altered the future of the monarchy itself. With tensions exposed and questions unanswered, the royal family now faces something it has long avoided: accountability. And as the dust begins to settle, one thing is certain: this story is far from over. In the weeks that followed, the palace moved carefully, aware that every gesture now carried amplified meaning. Unity could no longer be assumed, it had to be demonstrated. Yet demonstrations are not the same as resolution. Behind formal reassurances, deeper recalculations were unfolding. Long-standing power structures, once unquestioned, were being quietly reassessed. Who speaks for the institution? Who shapes its direction? And perhaps most crucially, who holds moral authority when tradition and transparency collide? Eugenie's words forced those questions into the open, and once spoken, they refused to retreat. The long-term implications for royal unity remain uncertain. Some insiders suggest her decision may accelerate overdue reforms, pushing the monarchy toward a more adaptive and accountable model. Others fear the opposite, that entrenched figures will tighten control, reinforcing hierarchy in response to perceived instability. What is clear is that influence within the family is no longer static. Subtle shifts are occurring. Voices once peripheral are being reconsidered. Those who dismissed her as incidental now recognize that visibility does not always equal impact. Sometimes the quietest presence becomes the most disruptive force. And where does that leave Eugenie herself? Her future role is suspended in ambiguity. She has neither stepped away nor fully stepped into leadership. Instead, she occupies a space that is both vulnerable and powerful. If the monarchy embraces measured evolution, she may become a bridge between generations, a symbol of conscience within tradition. If resistance hardens, she risks marginalization. The uncertainty surrounding her position mirrors the uncertainty surrounding the institution as a whole. Nothing feels entirely settled. Nothing feels entirely secure. There is also the possibility, unspoken but undeniable, that this was only the first revelation. The careful restraint in her statement suggests depth still concealed. Allies and critics alike are watching for what comes next. Will she expand on her claims? Will others follow her lead? The idea that silence may no longer be sustainable hangs heavily in the air. Once one member challenges the code of discretion, it becomes harder to demand unquestioned compliance from the rest. Precedent has power, and precedent once set is difficult to erase. The royal image has already been altered. It is no longer defined solely by ceremony and continuity, but by complexity and internal struggle. For some, that makes the institution more human, more relatable. For others, it exposes vulnerability where they once expected permanence. Either way, perception has shifted, and perception in a monarchy is everything. Success and suffering now exist side by side in the public consciousness. Tradition remains, but it is threaded with tension. As the dust continues to settle, the most pressing reality is this: accountability has entered the conversation in a way it never has before. The family can attempt to recalibrate, to modernize selectively, to project calm strength. But the expectation of transparency has taken root, and expectations, once formed, shape the future. Because in a family built on secrecy, one voice breaking silence can change everything, but it rarely ends the story, it only begins it. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.